So the question I think John would have for all of us today as Christ believers, and I think we need to press as Bible teachers is, are we blending in to the culture around us to the point that we don't signal a devotion to the Lordship of Jesus Christ and what that Lordship means for how we live our lives and how the world should be constructed, to the point that we don't anymore represent Christ, but we represent the actual world around us.
Hello, welcome to Great Bible Teacher Interviews. Each week I have the opportunity to interview a scholar or an author or a practitioner in the area of the Bible interpretation, or spiritual formation to help us learn how to be better teachers. This week, I'm very honored and happy to be able to present Dr. Brian Blount. Brian is the president and New Testament professor at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, and Charlotte, North Carolina. He came to that position in 2007 after serving for 15 years as professor of New Testament interpretation at Princeton Theological Seminary. His primary work has been in the Gospel of Mark and also in the book of Revelation, and in the area of cultural studies and hermeneutics. He is the author of 6 books. His commentary on Revelation, which was published by Westminster John Knox Press in 2009, was voted by the Academy of Parish Clergy as the 2009 top reference work. This is how I became acquainted with Brian Blount. I am using his commentary for a study I'm doing at my church on the book of Revelation, as well as another book that he published also through Westminster John Knox Press called Can I Get a Witness? And now here is Brian Blount. So our ministry is called Great Bible Teachers, and you are a Bible teacher yourself, and you've been influenced by Bible teachers. I wonder if you could share with us who has been a great Bible teacher in your life, and what made them a great Bible teacher that has shaped you.
Well, there have been several, and I suppose I could, if it's okay, I'll mention more than one.
Absolutely.
I'll start with Kane Hope Felder. He is an African-American biblical scholar. I just preached his eulogy this past fall of 2019. So I'm continuing now, to grieve his loss. But I met him in 1978 when I went to Princeton Theological Seminary as an MDiv student. So it was a formative time for me. It was a time when I was really beginning to engage in biblical studies in a very sustained and formal way. He was the first and the only African-American professor that I've had throughout my college and seminary and doctoral work. So because of that, also quite a mentor for me. Influenced my decision to do New Testament study. I went from seminary because I felt called into a church, and went to a church pastorate after I graduated from seminary. He kept needling me and asking me while I was in the church, when are you going to go back and do a graduate program and become a Bible scholar and become a Bible teacher? We need you in the discipline and these types of things. So I remember he was one of the ministers who married my wife and me. And even while he was there for the wedding, he was needling me about when I was going to make that decision. I learned from him how biblical interpretation is not an objective measure, but that it is influenced by the culture and the circumstance that we come from. He was very interested in helping people understand how African-American perspectives were influential and ought to be influential in the reading and interpretation of biblical texts. So he was one of the editors of Stone in the Road We Trod, an African-American look at biblical interpretation, signal work 30 years ago. As a matter of fact, I've been asked by the editors to write a new introduction for the 30th anniversary edition of that work. So for me, that's coming full circle, starting with a mentor and then being able to follow that mentor to write the introduction. He wrote the introduction for the first edition 30 years ago, and I have a chance to do that now alongside his. So that African-American perspective, a perspective of justice, a perspective of looking for liberation within the text that he pushed. Very diligent in historical critical methodology, to be sure, but also very open to allowing one's African-American perspective to challenge how the text was to be interpreted and how it had been interpreted in ways that were hostile to African-American perspective and liberation hopes in the past. So I would mention him as first. I also, J. Christian Becker, who did biblical interpretation on Paul at Princeton Seminary when I got there as a student, was also influential for me. So those, and he wrote from not from a liberation perspective, but he had been deeply impacted by the circumstances in World War II and Germany and Nazi Germany, and how that influenced his understanding of what Paul was writing. So he introduced me to Paul in some significant ways, and those are really influential. And then finally, I can't not mention my own doctor father at Emory University in the PhD program. He's not a name that probably your readers will know. I may not know the other ones either, but his name was Hendrik Boers. And he helped me look at how language and understanding language was important for reading biblical texts. And that helped me to think about the way in which biblical authors use their language to create their understanding of how God was operating in the world, particularly through Jesus Christ. But then it also, his perspective helped me realize that we who read from our language perspectives read and are influenced by the way we use language in our cultural background and our cultural circumstance. So that linguistic way of looking at the biblical text helped shape all of the work that I've done since then. So Hendrik is really influential for me as well. Now, I could talk about biblical scholars whose books I've read. These are famous names that all of your readers would know. But you asked me a question about the ones that were influential to me, and these three are very influential to me. And I would hope that some of your readers might pick up Kane Hope Felder, J. Christian Becker, and Hendrik Boers. They do some wonderful work on biblical interpretation.
Yeah, that's great. That's great to have some new names to read if they're new to us. I always enjoy doing that. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons I wanted to speak with you in particular is that I'm doing a study with my pastor on the book of Revelation. And you wrote a commentary on Revelation, and he mentioned that to me. So I got that commentary, and then I saw, well, he's also written another book, kind of a monograph, I guess, on Can I Get a Witness, about the African-American influence, or not influence, well, influence of interpretation on cultural studies, doing cultural studies with the book of Revelation, which was all fascinating to me. And so I thought, wow, this is the different perspective that I would love to hear from. And so you've mentioned part of this too already, is that being an African-American scholar puts you in a minority with Bible scholarship as well. But it's a very important perspective that we need to have. And I wonder if you could say something about that, about what is it that a minority, particularly African-American, but a minority position brings to biblical interpretation that those of us in the majority might just miss. It may just go completely over us or under us or what around us. You know, we just, but it's so obvious to someone of a minority position of interpretation.
Yes, well, for me, I began with reading from the lens of the African American slaves and their understanding of how God was operating in their lives and in their world and their ways of trying to interpret the biblical text through particular lenses. And it was a particular lens of God's act of liberation. So the Exodus event becomes really important, but also King Jesus. You look at the spirituals, you hear this language of King Jesus throughout. Jesus's connection with Moses, the Exodus, the liberation of God's people from Egypt, but also the liberation of God's people, redemption from sin, but then the brokenness that is more than just a personal sin, but it's the kind of sinfulness that allows us to, having broken away from God, break away from each other and treat each other unjustly and oppressively. So that lens is very important for African Americans reading biblical materials right from the slave tradition. For example, I use in some of my work some of the stories from slave narratives of persons who had interviewed people who had been slaves after and during the period of Reconstruction after the Civil War. And there's some fascinating stories. For example, there's one of my favorites is when these African-American slaves were being preached to by a white minister, because very often slave owners wouldn't allow black ministers to preach to their slaves because they couldn't be certain that they weren't going to be preaching Exodus and liberation themes and how being a Christian made one equal with everyone else. So you didn't want your preacher up there preaching that if you were a slave owner. So in this case, there was a white preacher who was preaching, and he was preaching about that from the text that slaves should be obedient to their masters as unto Christ. And then also preaching about, following up with that, about Philemon and, you know, the story of the slave Onesimus being sent back. And why it's important that slaves not run away, et cetera, from this biblical example. And then the slaves who were listening, half of them got up and left, and the other half stayed at the end to challenge the preacher to say, well, there can't be anything like that in the Bible. And if it is, it can't be interpreted that way, because that isn't how God is operating through Jesus in the way in which we understand what Jesus is doing in our lives. So there is a challenge to not only the interpretation of the text, but in some cases, a challenge to the text itself, where they felt the text was hostile to what they believed God was doing in the world through Jesus. So that's one of my favorite examples. Another example is the grandmother of Howard Thurman, who was an African-American spiritualist who had been at Howard University, the dean of the chapel there. And he's not as well known, obviously, as Martin Luther King Jr., but he was one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s teachers in the sense of being a mentor, someone who came before him and blazed trails that were important for Martin Luther King Jr. But in any case, Howard Thurman tells a story about his grandmother who was a slave. And he tells a story that whenever he went home from college or whatnot, his grandmother would have him read the Bible, because she, as a slave, wasn't taught to read, didn't have that capability. So he would read the Bible to her, and she would never let him read from the Apostle Paul, his letters. And so he writes that he asked her once, why won't you ever let me read from Paul? And she said that whenever old Master McGee would have his preachers come, he wouldn't let black preachers preach to us slaves. And the white preacher would often say things like, and quote text like, slaves be obedient to your master as unto Christ. And therefore she promised her maker that if freedom ever came, she would not read that part of the Bible. So, you know, there is this sense of a hope for liberation that is embedded within the perspective of looking at the text, and then challenging the text and challenging interpreters of the text through that perspective. So I think that's the key thing that I draw from as I look at African-American history and how that history becomes a lens for reading the biblical materials.
Mm. So these ideas, the Exodus, the liberation, those are themes that that if you're part of the dominant culture, you don't feel a need to be liberated. You don't feel a need to have an Exodus. But if you're being held down by the dominant culture, And it's like, wait a minute, this is a different Jesus we're seeing, or a different
That's
text.
right. That's right. And, one of the examples I use in the book of Revelation, when you talk about that interpretation, as you know from the book, Can I Get a Witness? I'm reading it from the lens of the civil rights movement. So therefore, hupomone is a Greek term that's really important in the book of Revelation. It's translated most often patient endurance. John asking his people, with the understanding that they patiently endure the suffering that's brought upon them by the Roman Empire and the persecution that comes from Romans when they declare and confess the lordship of Jesus Christ. Well, I interpret that, having looked at it through this lens, African-American lens of culture and history and civil rights, as nonviolent resistance. So when I translate hupomone, I don't translate it as patient endurance. I translate it as nonviolent resistance. John is asking his people to resist the claim that Rome or Rome's emperor is Lord, and to resist that even to the point where it may cost them their very lives. That's very much kind of the perspective that comes out of the civil rights movement. That doesn't mean that I'm suggesting that the civil rights movement is equal to what John is doing in the book of Revelation. They're not equal to each other, but I'm suggesting that if you look at and read the book through the lens of the civil rights movement, you see a unique part of what John is trying to convey that others will miss, because they're not looking at it from a more dominant cultural perspective.
Yes, yes. So let me read to you something that you said.
Okay.
Your commentary, and you can give further comment. This is just backing up with what you've just said. So this is from your commentary, and on early in it, let's see. Let me get the page right here. So it said John was asking his people to stand up, that is, witness, and thus stand out in the world they had accepted and that had accepted them. He was essentially telling them to go out and pick a fight. He was ordering them to declare that they were now non-accommodating Christ believers who could no longer participate in the world that had not previously noticed them, since they had heretofore been accommodating to it. In a classic don't ask, don't tell that I'm a Christian believer kind of environment, John was essentially ordering his followers to be about the business of telling on themselves, with full acknowledgement of the kind of repercussions such telling would bring. He was asking them to come screaming out of the Christian closet, knowing that that would solicit the same consequence it had attracted to the true one and faithful witness, execution. So that was, for me, as I was reading that was the biggest kind of head jerk kind of paragraph for me, saying, be non-accommodating and be not proud in a boastful way, but be proud of your identity in Christ, as opposed to accommodating to the identity to the emperor.
That's right. Yes.
So how does that relate to today's culture? Obviously we don't have a king that in an American democracy, but there is still cultural clash, I guess, that we have. What do you see the role of the Christian, but also, again, with our context of Bible teachers, what is the role of the Christian Bible teacher to students to say, this is your role as an interpreter of Scripture when it comes to culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a very good question. And of course, John, I believe, is trying to get his people, as you noted, to stop blending in and looking like the rest of the culture around them. One of the ways they would do that is by doing what everybody else did, and that was, even though they were testifying to the lordship of Jesus Christ, they would say, well, we can also testify to the lordship of Rome, or the lordship of Zeus, or the lordship of the emperor, or the lordship of Apollo, the Greek and Roman gods. Can we do both of them at the same time so we can just kind of get along? That we don't stand out. And of course, one of the things we know historically is that during the time that John was writing, when Domitian was emperor at the end of the first century, Christians weren't being systematically persecuted. They were only really persecuted if someone said, hey, he's a Christian or she's a Christian, and then they were brought before a tribunal and then asked the question, are you a Christian? And then if you said yes, then these repercussions would happen, even up to the taking of your life. So if you just kind of blended in, you didn't have that happen. So the question I think John would have for all of us today as Christ believers, and I think we need to press as Bible teachers, is are we blending in to the culture around us to the point that we don't signal a devotion to the Lordship of Jesus Christ and what that Lordship means for how we live our lives and how the world should be constructed, to the point that we don't anymore represent Christ, but we represent the actual world around us. One then has to decide, well, what does representing Christ look like? And particularly, how troublesome could that be? Well, what I do at that point is point students back to the entire New Testament, not just the book of Revelation, because it's looking at the end time when Christ, the risen Christ. I want them to look also at Jesus, who was operating here on earth. What does his ministry look like, and how are we comparing ourselves to the way he lived his ministry? So yes, he talked about the brokenness, the sinful relationship between us and God that was broken. So we talk about that. That's one thing. But he also did these other things, such as, well, we can start in the Gospel of Mark. Look at we started chapter 1, verse 40. He's touching lepers. He ought not to be doing that. He's calling tax collectors and sinners. He ought not to be doing that. He is suggesting that people no longer need to go to the temple to find forgiveness, because when he finds this man who's paralyzed and his friends have brought him to him, he says, not that you're healed of the paralysis, but your sins are forgiven. And that's why the rulers of the people get all upset with him, because he's suggesting that it's not the institution, but it's relationship with me that brings you into relationship with God. He's also cavorting with women in ways that a rabbi of the time should not be, treating them with a sense of discipleship that's scandalous at the time. He's also breaking laws like the Sabbath tradition, when it looks like we have legalized the laws to the point that the law can no longer protect human wholeness. In this case, when people are hungry, don't till for food on the Sabbath, or when someone's arm is broken, don't heal it on the Sabbath. These kinds of things. He's a troublemaker in that regard, because he's suggesting that God's future looks like these kinds of ways of operating, touching people who should not be touched, breaking laws that are breaking people. And, in the Gospel of Mark, I think the biggest one is an ethnic racial one, where he reaches out and touches Gentiles and brings Gentiles into the fold. That's incredibly problematic in the Gospel of Mark. All of those kinds of things, if we are to represent how God is operating in the world, we follow and represent that way of living in the world, and that can become problematic in the world that we find ourselves today. If we think about who the lepers are in our world, we draw them into our communities. If we think about who the tax collectors and the sinners are in our world, we draw them into our communities. If we treat in terms of gender relationships, women with the equality with men, in the ways in which there is an imbalance, there's an inequality gender-wise today. All of these kinds of things, we think about ethnicity and race and how we cross racial boundaries to create equality there. Then we're imaging Jesus, but we're also causing trouble in our world. So, I think what John is suggesting is don't just know about Jesus, but represent Jesus in a way that may cause trouble for you in the culture in which you find yourself. But in that case, what you should be more concerned about is testifying to Jesus's lordship and living into that lordship, rather than your own calm and security and even safety.
I think that'll preach.
Following, bringing up these images of Jesus, they do preach. They get you in trouble sometimes, but they do preach, because that's what I want my students to do. I want them to know these Jesus texts, and then understand what John is asking us to do, to live these Jesus texts, to proclaim these Jesus texts, and to know that sometimes it'll cause problems for you. But your call is not to be quiet and comfortable. Your call is to proclaim and live the life of Jesus.
Early in your commentary, you also, when you talk about John and his role as the writer, basically, you compare him to a sports coach. He said he's trying to get his team kind of fired up,
Right.
rallying his team. And, it seems like that maybe is a role that the Bible teacher has as well, is you only have them for, 30, 45 minutes a week, probably. And so you're trying to get them fired up to go out into the playing field again.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's very true. And, I remember an anecdote from some time ago when I was still teaching at, I'm here at Union Seminary now, but when I was teaching at Princeton Seminary, Princeton University was next to us. And I had, some talks with some professors at the university sometimes. And I remember talking to a professor once, and we were talking about the differences in our lecturing and classes and everything. She said, well, one of the differences I see is that I'm really asked to convey information, but you're also expected to inspire people. And I think that's right. I mean, our lectures are in a seminary setting are not just conveying information, they are that, but we're also expected to get our students engaged, inspired about living this information that we're conveying to them. It's more than just conveying ideas. It is that, but it's also compelling them to hold these ideas in a way that it transforms who they are, so that they therefore go out and use those ideas and what they have learned to be transformational in the world around them, to make the world look more like the way Jesus wanted the world to look. So lectures are not just experiments in sharing information. Lectures are inspirational, preaching, challenging moments, hopeful that the information you share creates kind of a fire that helps our students want to go out and then live the things they've heard in the classroom.
I love that that imagery of firing them up, and one of the things that intrigued me about the book, Can I Get a Witness? As I read it, my interpretation of it was that you kind of were working on the commentary and this book side by side, and that this book kind of was birthed and wasn't exactly the same fit with the commentary, so you did it separately. But what was new to me was the method of interpretation that has to do with cultural cultural studies,
Right.
and how that is different than basically I was trained, I guess you'd say, in critical historical methodology, but not so much in cultural studies. Could you say something about that, about the importance of that lens?
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, the cultural studies lens is one that operates from the perspective that the culture, the location, the history, the identity we bring with us to the text influences the way in which we interpret the text. And this was important for me in doing my dissertation. I was looking at linguistics, sociolinguistics at the time, but cultural studies is a larger framework for that. One of the simple exercises that sociolinguists use in terms of cultural appropriation and interpretation of text is to look at the word head. It means this up here, but if you're a farmer, it can mean a head of lettuce. If you are a teacher, it can mean the head of the class. If you're in the Navy, it can mean something else. It can mean the head, right? So that one word has all of this potential for meaning, depending on the location, a farmer or a teacher or a Navy officer, whatever the case might be. Now, all words have the same kind of potential for meaning. You put those words into sentences, you put those sentences into paragraphs, you put those paragraphs into chapters, you put those chapters into books, you have a whole lot of meaning potential that's there. What cultural studies suggests is that people from different cultures will see different parts of the potential for meaning in words and paragraphs and whole books. So that someone from the culture of the Navy sees the word head and thinks immediately of this thing. Well, someone from the culture of African-American history, where slavery and segregation and fighting for civil rights has been a huge part of his or her life all the way growing up, as it has been for me, that cultural location is important when you then look at Jesus saying that he is the light of the world. You read that language not just through the biblical language of folks, what the Greek word light is and all of these kinds of things, which is really important. I'm not discounting that. I'm saying we start with all that historical and critical. You look at the biblical material, you look at the Greek language, you look at how the grammar is working, you look at how the author is writing and the rest of the book, whether it's Paul or Mark or John and Revelation. But you also recognize that when you look at the word light, you also are looking at it not just as a neutral observer, but as an African-American observer or a European-American observer, or whatever, Native American observer, whatever the case might be. Your cultural location is with you when you engage that language in the text. It will help you see parts of the meaning potential of that language that someone from a different context may miss. And what cultural studies is suggesting is that that doesn't make your interpretation better or worse, it makes it different. And what you want to do is to hopefully be in conversation with people from other cultures so that you can learn what they are seeing when they read the text, and you can use the language of the historical and the critical as a cultural location itself. So that becomes part of the interpretive conversation that you're having, so that no one particular cultural location should have the right to say, I am the only one who reads this material objectively. Everybody else reads from their perspective. Everybody is reading from their perspective. That's what cultural studies is trying to say. And that's a good thing. That's not a bad thing.
Yeah. So, well, thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful because, as you say, when we're, especially if you've always been of one stripe. Let's say you're a Southern Baptist and you've been born a Southern Baptist and you've been raised a Southern Baptist and you're in a Southern Baptist church now and all you've heard are Southern Baptists. Then when you get let's even make it more defined that you're a white male Southern Baptist, then to hear an African American woman perspective, there's going to be some different interpretation of scriptures there, and it's the same word of God, but it's heard differently through the different ears,
right, and
spoken differently.
And hopefully one will want to be in conversation to learn what the other is seeing and hearing, and be challenged by what the other is seeing and hearing. And this doesn't mean that we in the end say, well, everybody's reading is correct, because we all know that there are times when readings conflict with each other. Mm-hmm. But we can learn from each other, and we can learn in the conflict where we feel more encouraged about our own reading, or sometimes in the conflict. I mean, there have been times I've read some things in conflict with, and I've said, I actually think they have a better reading than I do. Mm-hmm. That's a part of being a biblical scholar. We challenge each other in biblical scholarship. We critique each other in biblical scholarship. That's how we learn, and that's how we teach our students to learn. But you can only do that if you're willing to appreciate the perspective someone else brings in their biblical interpretation. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that in the end because their interpretations I simply reject. Because I don't think they're faithful readings of the language of the text. And I also think they're hostile to the liberative intent that God has in the way in which God has revealed God's self through Jesus of Nazareth. So for me, there are times, and I'll say that is not a helpful reading of a text, and I can't follow it. Yet, I'm not outright rejecting it. I'm trying to understand how you got to that reading so that I can be in conversation with you and tell you why I disagree with that reading.
Yes. So the conversation is very important. rather than just out of hand. How did you come to that interpretation?
Right. And I think that's the job of a Bible teacher. I think that's what our goal is. I mean, there are going to be students who come into my classroom. They're not going to be. There have been across the years. I've been teaching almost 30 years, and there are many students who come into the classroom. They disagree with my perspective on the text, and I tell them, you know, when you write your paper, I don't want you to write a paper trying to figure out how you're going to mimic what I've said. I don't want you to try to impress me by demonstrating that you believe what I believe for the very reasons I believe it. What I'd like to do is, when you disagree with me, what I want to do is see how you base what you believe about the text on your reading of the text and your interpretation from the perspective you come to the text with. Mm-hmm. So I want to know how you got to where how you got to the place where you arrived. That's what I want to know and I want to see. And I want to teach you how to do that better. And I also want to teach you well enough so that there be sometimes, as it has happened to me, and if you're reading in a very critical and faithful way, I think it's going to happen to all of us. You'll start out thinking one thing about a text, and having studied it, you will come to a conclusion, well, I started out over here, but now I really believe the text is saying this over here. Mm-hmm. And my learning, I hope that my teaching in the classroom and what you've learned from me in the classroom will help you realize why you started out over here and you ended up over here. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what learning and teaching and studying the biblical material is all about.
Yeah. If we're always where we were, there's no growth is happening. So,
That's right. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. And I've really appreciated, like I say, I'm continuing to use your commentary as I'm reading through, and it's been very enriching for me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That as a person who writes this material and teaches in it, that's what you want to hear. You hope your material is helpful for others.
I want to thank Brian Blount for his time and his wisdom that he has shared with us. A couple of takeaways for me. One is that Jesus was a troublemaker. And therefore, if we are teaching our students how to be like Jesus, sometimes that might mean being a troublemaker, to cause some problems in the culture because the culture is not a Christian culture. The second takeaway for me has to do with culture as well, but the importance of cultural studies. Understanding that we are not neutral observers when we come to the text, that the backgrounds that we have influence and give us our lens to see and interpret the biblical text, which means, though, that someone else brings a different culture and a different lens. So if we will be open to hearing from them, reading with them, listening to them, then we will gain perspectives on the Bible and on the life of Jesus that we would not have had on our own. So it's a good thing to look for persons who are different from us to gain understanding of what God has to say to our world today. Thank you again for joining us. Please leave comments below or questions if you have them. Also, sign up for the e-news at greatbibleteachers.com, where twice a week you'll get an email, one with a blog article and one announcing the interview of the week. Thank you again for joining. I look forward to seeing you next week.